But let's try it. So welcome, everyone. So first, if you were not here last week, let me start by just reassuring you that if you didn't hear last week, it still will not diminish your ability to appreciate or follow this week. They're all independent, freestanding. Okay, so this week, we're gonna focus on Maimonides, on the Rambam. I'm going to assume that Maimonides, Rambam, is someone you've heard of, someone you're familiar with. I think he's probably has to be one of the most high-profile Jews in the history of Jews, past and present. I mean, there are so many things named after him today. And he's not only well-known among Jews. You know, if you go to Spain, not only he's remembered in Spain, not only among Jews, but also as a part of Muslim Spain, and everyone remembers him. He's oftentimes, as far as medieval philosophers go, he's often, seen together, Maimonides with a Muslim philosopher named Averroes and a Christian philosopher named Thomas Aquinas. The three of them were roughly contemporary, and they were doing similar kinds of things. But that's not what I want to talk about tonight. I don't want to focus, on so much the ideas of the Rambam, although we will talk about some of them. What I'd really like to focus on in my time machine, our time machine adventure, what I'd like to go back and look at is what it meant to be the Rambam, a week in the life of the Rambam. Because, this guy was someone who wasn't just one of the great scholars, and not only a scholar of rabbinics, but also a scholar of philosophy and a physician. That's not all he was, but in his day-to-day life as a leader of the Jewish community, not only of his own community, but also the Jewish community of Egypt, and as the physician of the royal court in Egypt, this guy stayed busy, especially the last 20 or 25 years of his life. So just to give you sort of the short version of what I want to talk about tonight, look at your handout. I want to look at the first text where, in 1199, which is toward the end of his life, Maimonides living in a suburb of Cairo called Fushtat. I don't know if you've ever, Fushtat it's the suburb of Cairo where all the Jews lived. It's like Oak Park. Well, Oak Park used to be. I suppose it's like West Bloomfield now outside of Cairo. In fact, the Rambam is not only known as Maimonides and also known as the Rambam, sometimes he is referred to as HaChacham MiFushtat, the sage of Fushtat. So, living in Fushtat in 1199, one of his students, whose name was Shmuel ibn Tibon, wrote to him and said, well, he had a halakhic question, but he also said, I was thinking of maybe coming to visit you, spend some time, catch up, do some learning. And this is what he wrote to his student. This is his answer, his response to his student who wanted to come and visit him in Fushtat. So this is text number 1. Quote, I reside in Egypt, and the Sultan in Cairo, and remember, the Sultan, he is the royal physician of the court of the Sultan in Cairo. The Sultan in Cairo lives 2 Sabbath day journeys away. That means he lived about 1.5 miles away, which in those days is quite a journey. Now, he wasn't going there on Shabbat, but even by carriage, it was probably more than an hour. My duties to the Sultan are very heavy. I'm obliged to visit him every day, early in the morning, and when he or any of his children or any of the inmates of his harem are indisposed, I dare not quit Cairo, but must stay during the greater part of the day, and even if nothing unusual happens. In other words, in modern parlance, we would say 6 days a week, he is on call at the royal court of the Sultan in Cairo. 6 days a week, and he is there all day. I do not return to Fushtat until the afternoon. Then I am almost dying with hunger. I find the antechambers filled with people, judges, bailiffs, friends, and foes. This is the antechambers of his own house and synagogue in Fushtat. There are all these people a mixed multitude who await the time of my return. Remember, he's also the leader of the Jewish community of Fushdat and the best scholar in town, so they have lots of questions to him. I dismount from my animal, wash my hands, go forth to my patients, and entreat them to bear with me while I partake of some light refreshments, the only meal I take in 24 hours. Apparently he was an intermittent faster. Then I attend to my patients, write prescriptions and directions for their various ailments. Patients go in and out until nightfall, and sometimes even, I solemnly assure you, until 2 hours and more into the night. I converse with and prescribe for them while lying down from sheer fatigue, and when night falls, I am so exhausted that I can scarcely speak. In consequence of this, no Jew can have any private interview with me except on Shabbat. On that day, the whole congregation, or at least the majority of the members, comes to me after the morning service when I instruct them as to their proceedings during the whole week. They come to me with halakhic questions, and I answer their questions all day. We study together a little till noon when they depart. Some of them return and read with me after the afternoon service until evening prayers, and this manner I spend the day. This is his week. I have related to you only a part of what you would see if you were to visit me. Now, this was his very nice way of telling a student, please don't visit me. He's saying, I honestly do not have time for you or anyone else on top of the load I have. So look, this is 6 days a week. He's working all day and then exhausted. And then after work, he's dealing with Jewish communal matters. And then on Shabbat, he's answering halakhic questions all day. When he had time to write anything, I have no idea, because look at this. This was his week after week after week after week, even on Shabbat. Now, I suppose on Chagim, on Yom Tov, maybe he got a break. I doubt it. People were coming to him with questions all the time. So what fascinates me is first of all, what this weekly schedule tells us is there was so much more to the Rambam than simply a towering scholar. He embodied, first of all, the absolute best of Jewish communal leader. He was entirely devoted to the Jews who needed his help. And he also was very much part of a royal court. He's what we refer to in that period of time as a Jewish courtier, which kept him very busy. Implicitly, he also served the role of what in Hebrew was called the shtadlan. The shtadlan is the person who intercedes on behalf of the Jewish community with the state or royal authorities or some outside authority in case the Jewish community has a kind of problem. That was his job as well. His job was to defend the Jewish community, to help them deal with problems, which he did constantly. So he is living with one foot very much in the world of the Jewish community and Judaism, but in the other foot, he's living very much in the world of the court in Egypt, in the Caliphate of Egypt. And remember, if you're part of that inner circle of the Sultan, you're not just the doctor. If you're the physician of the Sultan, that means you are someone who is trusted. He is one of the closest confidants of the Sultan. I mean, he knows things about the royal family, personal things that nobody else knows, and his discretion is obviously expected. And this is a very serious thing. He was privy to information, that knowledge that few people were aware of. You know, in comparable situation in Victorian England was when everyone was very discreet, hyper discreet and private about everything. Physicians were often excluded from high society simply because they knew too much. But with the Rambam, the implication here is we are going to invite you into this elite circle, to the highest echelons of society, of Muslim society in Egypt, but we're going to assume that you're going to remain loyal and you're going to remain steadfast, and you are going to be discreet. And he managed to do all of those things. Now, one of the consequences of living with one foot in one world and one foot in the other world is the way he understood the world, both the Jewish world and the world around the Jewish world. He saw the two as intimately interwoven. He didn't see these as two separate parts of his life, two compartmentalized parts of his life. He saw this as one integrated, organic whole. In fact, that's the way he understood what it meant to be Jewish in the world, not only for him, but generally. Okay? So let's start, or let's expand a little bit. First of all, we have to ask the very basic question: how is it that he came to be in that situation? How is it that Moses ben Maimon, who wasn't born in Egypt, he came there as an adult, how did he rise so high in the ranks, both Jewish life and the life of the Sultan? So let's talk a little bit about who he was and how he got to be there. He was born in Spain in 1135. Now the date, if that date doesn't immediately mean something to you, I would describe it as he was born in the waning years of the golden age of Jews of Spain. So most of Spain was still Muslim in 1135. And remember, for several centuries before, Spain had been a pretty good place for Jews to live. Jews had thrived in Spain, in Muslim Spain. It's one of these great moments in Jewish history. Not perfect, but it was a great place to be. And Cordoba had been one of the great Jewish communities of Muslim Spain. And his family had been there for several generations. But by the time he was born, the situation in Spain was beginning to deteriorate. You know, in the beginning of the 1100s, Muslim Spain, first it broke into separate smaller caliphates. Northern Spain was conquered by Christians, or from a Christian point of view, it was reconquered by Christians. This is what Christians called Reconquista. They were conquering it back from the Muslims who had conquered it in 732 BCE. Man, do these people hold grudges. So they were reconquered. So there was a different situation for Jews in northern Spain, which was Christian. And in southern Spain was conquered by Muslim tribes, Muslim clans from North Africa. In this case, in 1148, Cordoba was conquered by the Almohads. Now, what was distinct about the Almohads as Muslims is they were Muslim fundamentalists. Most of the most Muslim families and caliphs who had ruled in Muslim Spain, they believed wholeheartedly in that fundamental Muslim principle known as the dhimmi, where Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians, people with a scriptural religion, were exempt from the pressure to convert to Islam. They were defined as protected people, and although they had a second-class status compared to Muslims, they were generally treated with respect and allowed basically to be Jewish or to be Christian or to be Zoroastrian. That's how, depending where you were in the world of Islam, that's how Jews were able to thrive. The Almohads had a very different notion. They had a much narrower and stricter interpretation of the concept of the dhimmi. In fact, their understanding of Jews and Christians as a second-class status was much closer to how Christians treated Muslims and Jews. The Almohads' notion was, yes, technically, we're not supposed to kill Jews, and we're not, but we're going to tolerate them a lot less than our predecessors did. And we're going to pressure them. We're going to put more pressure on Jews and Christians to become Muslim. So it became harder and harder to be Jewish in places like Cordoba under the Almohads. Now, Jews who had lived in Muslim Spain comfortably for a long time, we see different Jewish responses. There were some Jews who moved from southern Spain to northern Spain. They rolled the dice in Christian Spain, which probably for about 150 years or a little more was actually a pretty good gamble. Until a certain point, and that's a separate story, the conditions for Jews were pretty good. So if you ever heard of the commentator Ibn Ezra, he's someone who did that. Or there was a Jewish chronicler named Abraham ibn Daud. He went up to northern Spain. But other Jews said, we need to get out of Spain. Now, for the Jews who got out of Spain, we also see there's two different strategies or two different goals. We have someone like Yehuda Halevi. Yehuda Halevi, the great medieval Spanish Jewish poet, he basically gave up on the future of Jews in the diaspora and headed for the land of Israel. And maybe he made it, maybe he didn't. But in his mind, the diaspora was done for Jews. But the Maimon family, although they agreed with Yehuda Halevi that you had to leave Spain, they still believed that the situation under the Almohads was more the exception than the rule, that in general, Muslim Spain was still not only safe for Jews, but a place where Jews could thrive. And so when they left Cordoba in 1148, when Maimonides was a teenager, they crossed the Mediterranean at the Strait of Gibraltar, and they settled in Fez, Morocco. And they lived in Morocco for a time. Now, it's in Morocco that Maimonides, as a young adult, he had one of his first mentors, whose name was Yehuda HaKohen Ibn Susan. Ibn Susan it basically gave him his basic knowledge of halakha and also got him interested in studying philosophy. But Morocco, too, eventually came under the rule of the Almohads, and conditions there began to deteriorate, too. And for Maimonides, sort of the telling moment was his mentor, Ibn Susan, was martyred. He was told, either you convert to Islam or you're going to be killed. He refused, and he was executed. And in 1165, after living in Morocco for 17 years, they made the same choice. They said, okay, Spain is no good anymore, Morocco's no good anymore, but that's all the Almohads. We just get far enough away from them, we can find a situation in the Muslim world that's habitable, and that's why they went to Egypt. They moved to Egypt at the end of the 1160s. They settled in Fushtat, and he lived there for the last 50 years of his life, or 40 years of his life, quite well. You know, they had hoped to find a place in the Muslim world that was still receptive to Jews. They hoped that the Almohads were the exception, not the rule. And during the life of Maimonides, they were right. The Muslim world, with obvious exceptions, was still a better place to be Jewish than anywhere in the Christian world. Pretty much anywhere in the world. It was still a good place to be Jewish. So once in Fushtat, things settled down, and that's where he was able to build his life. So it's during his arrival in Fushtat where he composes. He's a rising star in the Jewish community, and he composes one of his first great rabbinic works. This is known as his Mishneh Torah, Maimonides' Code of Law. Now, he actually tells us in very specific terms in the introduction to the Mishneh Torah why he's writing this code of law. Now, first I'll tell you what it is. Basically, you know, in the Talmud, if you ever study the Talmud, the Talmud doesn't read like a code of law. The Talmud reads more like the congressional record. If you've ever read the congressional record, these are these discussions of law. And then you have these digressions where, you know, the good senator from Georgia reads in a recipe for peach pie or something. But if you really want to find out what you are allowed and what's permitted and forbidden in Judaism, the Talmud is not a great place to look, because these are discussions and they don't even always resolve. It's not a code of law. And Maimonides went through the Talmud and through the early commentators of the Talmud and through the responsa of rabbis who lived after the Talmud, especially the Gaonim of Baghdad, and he compiled this user-friendly list of what to do and what not to do for Jews. The Mishneh Torah is a highly readable code of Jewish law. It's also, the Hebrew of the Rambam is so accessible. If you ever wanted an excuse to learn to read Hebrew, being able to read the Hebrew of the Rambam is certainly a good excuse to do it. It's readable, it's easy, it's laid out in the same sections and topics of the Mishnah and the Talmud. That's why it's called the Mishnah Torah. But why did he choose to write specifically this kind of work at this time? Look at text number 3. This is early on in one of the earlier sections where he's explaining why he's doing this. And he says, quote, Ubazman hazeh, at this time, we have been beset by additional difficulties. Everyone feels financial pressure. The wisdom of our sages has become lost because everyone's wandering around, moving from place to place. And the comprehension of our men of understanding has become hidden. In other words, he says that there are these dislocations. The great center of Jewish life in Spain has been uprooted, and the centers of learning of Jewish Spain have been dispersed to different parts of the Jewish world. And Maimonides said, in this moment of dislocation, we don't want to lose this great corpus of knowledge that we have. Therefore, these explanations, laws, replies, which the Gaonim, the sages that immediately followed the Talmud, composed and considered to be fully explained material, have become difficult to grasp in our age, and only a select few comprehend these matters in the proper way. Needless to say, there is confusion with regard to the Talmud itself, both the Jerusalem and the Babylonian Talmuds. Then he mentions other books, books of commentary and midrash, the Sifra, the Sifri, the Tosefta, for they require a breadth of knowledge, a spirit of wisdom, and much time for appreciating the proper path regarding what is permitted and forbidden, and other laws of the Torah. In other words, it's a chaotic time, and people are starting to forget because we don't have this. It's not clear where the center of Jewish learning, it's not clear where the center of Jewish life is at this moment, because the great center in Spain was uprooted. Therefore, I girded my loins, I, Moses, the son of Maimon of Spain, and I relied upon the rock, blessed be he, meaning God. I contemplated all these texts and sought to compose a work which would include the conclusions derived from all these texts regarding forbidden and permitted, impure and pure, and the remainder of the Torah's laws, and all in clear and concise terms, so that the entire oral law could be organized in each person's mouth without question or objection. In other words, the times demanded it, and he did it. And it was enormously important. At a chaotic time, the Mishnah Torah became a guide, an important tool, especially for Jews who were moving from place to place, who were encountering different customs than their own. It really kind of helped hold things together. I should say parenthetically that, in part it was dislocation that prompted the writing of the Mishnah Torah. It was also in a different situation, a different moment of dislocation that prompted the Talmud to be written down, that prompted the Mishnah to be written down. Later, the Shulchan Aruch was written not long after the expulsion from Spain later on. There seems to be this connection between dislocation and the need to have this new definitive work of Jewish law and custom. But he lays it out for us. So one of the first things he does in Egypt, and his path to becoming the master Jewish scholar for the Jews of Egypt and a leader of the Jewish community, is the Mishnah Torah. Now, around the time he finished the Mishnah Torah, he finished writing the Mishnah Torah, was another seminal moment in his life. His brother David, who was a few years younger, died young. Now, that kind of upset the family plan, because the Maimon family plan until this point was Moses was going to be the scholar and David was going to be the breadwinner. David Maimon, or David Maimonides, I guess, before he died, he was a successful merchant. He was a really good businessman. And he was involved in local business, but eventually he set his sights higher. He joined this small corps of international Jewish merchants who operated out of Egypt along the Mediterranean, but also eastward. He had these commercial ventures that went all the way to the Indian Ocean. He was all over the place, but at one point, the vessels that he was sailing on, there was a storm, and he was lost at sea. He drowned. Now, This meant that since he was no longer the breadwinner of the family, Moses now had to become the breadwinner because somebody had to support the family. This is why he became a doctor. He became a physician, not only because he loved science and he thought he was an intellectual, but he needed to be a scholar and a breadwinner. And this was also part of his worldview. He was very clear that families need to support themselves. Scholars need to be self-supporting. In his mind, self-supporting included my brother supports me, or my father, or my whatever it is. He did what he believed. I'll give it to you in his own words. In the Mishnah Torah, he actually makes a comment about what it means to be a scholar, the relationship between being a scholar and livelihood. Look at text number 2. This is also from the Mishnah Torah. Anyone who comes to the conclusion that he should involve himself in Torah study without doing work and derive his livelihood from charity. In other words, if you were thinking maybe being a scholar and then just sort of living off the Jewish community or living off the donations of others, Maimonides says, desecrates God's name, dishonors the Torah, extinguishes the light of faith, brings evil upon himself, and forfeits the life of the world to come, for it is forbidden to derive benefit from the words of Torah in this world. In other words, studying Torah should be part of your way of life. It shouldn't be your livelihood. You should make your livelihood doing something else. Now, I'm not going to walk down the streets of Mea Shearim and Bnei Brak and yell this out loud, because I've always wondered, when they read this, what can they possibly think? I do not know. But that's what Maimonides thought. And in his life, he did a lot of teaching. He did a lot of learning with a lot of people. He had many disciples. He never accepted a penny for any of that. His income was from being a physician. It's one of the reasons why he structured his life the way he did. He was not going to earn money. He was not going to be a charity case for any Jewish community. In his mind, there were better things to do with your money. Okay. So he becomes a physician, and between being a scholar and remember, not only a scholar but also a philosopher, because his whole image of what it means to be a Jewish scholar and a communal leader, for that matter, the image of that, the model, was very much the Sephardic model. He grew up in Spain. He came to Morocco and Egypt along with other Sephardic Jews. And so Maimonides was very much in the image of that ideal scholar. Now, what do I mean by the Sephardic model of the ideal scholar? Well, I'll contrast it with the Ashkenazic model. For a very long time, probably until the 19th or 20th century, the Ashkenazic model of the ideal scholar is just Talmud Torah. You just sit and study Talmud all day, maybe do a little Chumash on the side, but be the best Talmudic scholar is the best scholar. That's what it means. Nothing else is really that important. There are Ashkenazic writers through the ages. I always find this one always resonates for me. They said, if you want to read something about Jewish history, that's something you read on the toilet in the bathroom. That's not really studying. I love when they say that. That always makes me feel so good and fulfilled. But that's why I never read Jewish history in the bathroom. I'm going to show them. No. But that's the Ashkenazic model. The Sephardic model, which really dates back to the Jews of Baghdad, was, yes, you need to know Talmud, and you need to know everything rabbinic. You need to be a master scholar of all of that. But you also need to know philosophy. You can't just know Talmud. You have to be able to be part of the world. And you have to understand Jewish knowledge in the framework of broader knowledge. And Maimonides, in addition to being one of the greatest Talmudic scholars who ever lived, was also one of the greatest Aristotelian philosophers who ever lived. Part of his scholarly life was not only mastering both the Talmud and mastering the philosophy of Aristotle, but also reconciling the two of those two things together. And his other important book, a small little book that he sort of wrote on the side, was called The Guide to the Perplexed. In Hebrew, it's called Moreh Nevuchim. It was actually originally written in Arabic, not in Hebrew, and it was translated to one. But The Guide to the Perplexed, by the perplexed, he was referring to scholars, and especially young scholars, who studied, as they were supposed to, both the Talmud and rabbinic writings, but also philosophy, and they were perplexed by contradictions between the two. Because the Rambam was equally devoted to the teachings of Aristotle as he was to the teachings of the Talmud. Now, the Talmud was his religious authority, but as sets of ideas, the Rambam saw the two of those things absolutely inseparable. You needed both. Now, I don't expect you to take my word for it, but I want to just give you a quick excerpt of the way he explained that, because the fact that he lived with a foot in both worlds wasn't just his day-to-day life, it was his view of the world. So in The Guide to the Perplexed, one of the things he writes in The Guide to the Perplexed is what he called the parable of the king's court. So we're going to go a little out of order. Turn to the back of your handout. Look at text number 9. I did a little out of order. Okay? So he's going to tell a parable, the parable of the king's court, and then he's going to explain the parable. Okay? So he says, I will begin with the subject of this chapter with a simile, a parable. A king is in his palace, and spoiler alert, the king is God, okay? And his palace is heaven. Spoiler alert. And all of his subjects are partly in the country and partly abroad. Of the former, some have their backs turned towards the king's palace and their faces in another direction. Yada, yada, yada. Basically, he's creating a hierarchy of how close different types of people are to the king in his court. Who's closer to God? Who's farther away from God? Now, the idea here, what he's setting up, is based on something that Aristotle wrote. Aristotle defined what he called the primary scale of being. Aristotle went through all of nature, from inanimate objects all the way to people, and arranged them in a hierarchy of, I don't know what to call it, wisdom or significance or whatever it is. So you start with rocks, but plants are more important than rocks, but insects are more important than plants, and then, mammals are more important than insects or whatever. And then with people too, and the hierarchy goes to different kinds of people. For Aristotle, women obviously were lower than men in Aristotle's primary scale of being because he lived so long ago. At the top of Aristotle's primary scale of being are, of course, as philosophers often do, are philosophers just like Aristotle. There's no philosopher who didn't put himself or herself at the end of their own hierarchy of knowledge. Okay? That's Aristotle. So Maimonides is going to do something parallel with people, especially, in their relationship to God. For Aristotle, God wasn't really part of this. It was about nature. But Maimonides is going to do who's closer to God. Okay, so look at the second paragraph at the bottom of page 4. He says, I will now explain the simile. Now he's going to talk about specific groups of people. The people who are abroad, like really far from the king's court, are those that have no religion, neither one based on philosophical speculation nor by tradition. People who are basically ignorant, unenlightened in any way. They don't know philosophy, they don't know religion. Those who are in the country, in other words, closer, but have their backs turned toward the king's palace, are those who possess religion, belief, and thought, but hold false doctrines. They're misinformed, which they either adopted in consequence of great mistakes, made in their own speculations, or received from others to lead them. In other words, they might have some religious belief, but they have the wrong religious belief. So for Maimonides, a pagan, someone who was still a polytheist in his life, you may have some sort of religious belief, but you're farther away. Those who desire to arrive at the palace and enter it, but have never yet seen it, are the mass of religious people, the multitude that observe the divine commandments, but are ignorant. Now he's talking more specifically about Jews. Jews who are observant, But unlearned, yeah, they're a little closer, but they're still far removed. Those who arrive at the palace but go round it are those who devote themselves exclusively to the study of practical law. So Jews who are learned, but the only learning they do is Jewish learning and nothing else. They're a little closer, but they're not all the way there yet. They believe traditionally in true principles of faith and learn the practical worship of God, but are not trained in philosophical treatment of the principles of the law and do not endeavor to establish the truth of their faith by proof, meaning philosophical or logical proof or rational proof. So basically what he's saying is, if all you've done is study Talmud your whole life and nothing else, it's almost a sidelong little swipe. You can hear him almost saying, listen, Ashkenazic Jews up there in Europe who sit in your yeshivas and do nothing else but study Talmud, you're closer to God than ignorant people, and certainly people maybe of other religions, but you're not as close as those who study both the Talmud and philosophy. That's what you need to do. In our own terms, really what he's anticipating. What he's anticipating is what we today would call a dual curriculum Jewish school. We learn Jewish stuff and you learn secular stuff and you do it together. That, for Maimonides, is the ideal learned Jew. You can't have one without. So if all you do is philosophy but no Jewish learning, you're incomplete. And if all you do is Jewish learning but no philosophy, you are incomplete. It's interesting because everybody claims Maimonides as one of their own. I mean, today. I've heard Reform rabbis say he would definitely be Reform if he was alive. And I've heard conservative rabbis and Orthodox rabbis. I've heard Chabadniks say it. I've heard humanists say it. Obviously, if you ask me, he would belong to this synagogue and be a Jewish studies academic. I mean, that's obviously what he would be. I mean, everyone else, they can have their ideas if they want. But he did have a very clear idea of what a full scholar was. So in his mind, he is devoting his life, living both, engaged in using his medical knowledge to aid the family of the Sultan, and using his Jewish knowledge, his rabbinic knowledge, to lead and guide the Jewish community. He didn't value one over the other. Those were two halves of a full identity, of a full life. But I would press it a step further, too, because one of the things that made his extremely busy and arduous life possible was a sense of balance. Maimonides was someone who really believed that you shouldn't go too far to the extreme in any direction. Let me give it to you the way he said it. Look at text number 4. This is also from the Mishnah Torah. From the first section of the Mishnah Torah. So he's going to define something called Haderech HaYeshara, the straight path. Incidentally, the Greek word for straight path is orthodoxus. So, like small o, orthodox. Okay, that's just an aside. What is the straight path? What is the proper way to live one's life as a Jew? Quote, the straight path, this involves discovering the midpoint temperament of each and every trait that man possesses within his personality. This refers to the trait which is equidistant from either of the extremes without being close to either of them. Therefore, the early sages instructed a man to evaluate his traits, to calculate them, and to direct them along the middle path so that he will be sound. In other words, if I can quote, I'll quote my mom, everything in moderation. That is something he believed in. I know, Mom, you're very Maimonidean. You've always been very Maimonidean. Everything in moderation. That's the way one lives. Now, moderation does not mean mediocrity. It doesn't mean middled or confused. You avoid extremes. And so that mentality enabled him to really not be too entirely invested only in the Jewish community, but not be entirely invested only outside the Jewish community. He was very much invested in doing both. And that really was a big part of what he was doing. Now, all of that really was in play in his mind, once he got to Egypt. So, eventually he was appointed as the Nagid of the Jews of Egypt. Nagid, it's a word we encountered last week. A Nagid basically in the diaspora was the unofficial or the official leader of a Jewish community. It's like the Nagid, you sort of have the powers of a king or a sovereign without the title. So he was the Nagid of the Jewish community of Egypt, and eventually, as I mentioned, first he became the physician of the royal vizier of the Sultan, Al-Qadi al-Fadil. In terms of Disney movies, he was the doctor. First he was the doctor of Jafar, and then he became a doctor of the emperor. Okay? Incidentally, the Sultan that he served was Saladin, and there's speculation that Saladin was the one who went to war during the Crusades against Richard the Lionhearted and captured Richard the Lionhearted. Some people believed, and there's no evidence of this, that one of the people that Maimonides treated was Richard the Lionhearted. Maybe. It would be. I would love to say, yes, and we have this letter. No, but maybe he might have. Circumstantially, he might have. Okay. So the last decades of his life, he was royal physician, he was Nagid, he spent his whole life doing this. Now there's one last aspect of his life that he regarded as very important, which I think underscores everything that we've said so far, and I think in a lot of ways it really ties a lot of it together, okay? And he was a defender as leader of the Jewish community. He was not only the intercessor or the mediator between the Jewish community and the Sultan, he helped ensure the stable status of the Jewish community, not only in Fushtat, but in Egypt generally. He was very much instrumental in the Jews of Egypt prospering for a long time. But he also defended the Jewish community against critics of the Jewish community. Now, occasionally this meant engaging Muslim scholars who would say negative things about the Jewish community. But the more typical critic of the Jewish community and of Judaism that Maimonides engaged from his perch in Egypt was a group known as the Karaites. Now, long story short, the Karaites were a Jewish sect. The Karaites were a group who started out as a group of Jews, actually, depending on how you define the beginning, either in the 800s or in the 900s, first in Baghdad, other parts of the Muslim world. What the Karaites did is, sometimes it's misunderstood that they only observed strictly the laws of the Torah and nothing else. That's not exactly right. They observed the laws of the Torah, but they rejected the singular and final and exclusive authority of the Talmud and the rabbis. And the Karaites constructed an alternative tradition of interpretations and explanations to the laws of the Talmud. So they weren't exclusively biblical Jews. The name Karaim is related to Mikra, which means the Torah, and they were called that because they were misunderstood to say, we only follow the strict letters of the laws of the Torah. That was the Sadducees. That wasn't the Karaites. But, they were violating a cardinal principle of Judaism at the time. When the Talmud was codified in around 500 CE, and within 100 or 150 years, throughout the Jewish world, there was a principle, there was a consensus of a principle called Sof Hora'ah. Sof Hora'ah literally means the end or the finality of the guidance. It really means the finality of the authority of the Talmud. Meaning there was this long period of discussion and interpretation, but if the Talmud reached a certain conclusion, that became definitive and could not be overturned. And generations of scholars after the Talmud, they would engage the laws of the Talmud. They would try to reinterpret them, but they didn't try to overturn them. You really couldn't. But what the Karaites said is, no, anything that's post-biblical is still up for grabs. In other words, the oral tradition of law, which the mainstream oral tradition was codified into the Talmud, the Karaites didn't believe that had an exclusive monopoly on authority or authenticity in Judaism, so they came up with alternate interpretations of Jewish things. And sometimes they were stricter, and sometimes they were more lenient. Typically, they were stricter. I'll give you an example. In the Torah, it says you should not kindle a flame on Shabbat. Lo teva'aru esh b'chol moshvotechem b'yom HaShabbat. You should not kindle a flame anywhere in your domain on Shabbat. The rabbis eventually interpreted that to mean that if you kindled the flame before Shabbat, you could use it, you could sit by it, you could derive the heat and light from it as long as it was lit before Shabbat. The Karaites said, no fire on Shabbat means even if it was lit before, there will be no fire on Shabbat. They sat in the dark. It was a stricter interpretation. And there was a whole list of things they did differently. Now, Maimonides was one of the rabbis of his time who regarded the teachings of the Karaites as a real threat to the integrity of Judaism and especially to the unity of the Jewish world. He liked the fact, by the time of Maimonides, there was a certain unity around the world. You could go to a synagogue pretty much anywhere in the world by this point, and the service, with some variations, was more or less uniform. The way the Torah was read, Jews everywhere were reading the same thing in the Torah. And Maimonides was one of many who treasured that sense of unity and the unity that came out of that uniformity. So there was plenty of diversity of custom, but certain things, the unity and uniformity were important. He thought that the Karaites were a threat to that. So, one of the first times he heard about the Karaites was a letter he received from the Jews of Yemen. The Jews of Yemen were kind of having a hard time, really beginning in the 1170s. The situation was getting difficult. And in addition to dealing with a Muslim leader who was getting harsher and less tolerant, they're also dealing with some Karaites. So this is what Maimonides wrote in his epistle to Yemen, Igeret Teman. This is text number 5. Okay? It is incumbent upon you to know that the rule that nothing may be added or diminished from the laws of Moses applies equally to the oral law, that is, to the traditional interpretation transmitted through the stages of blessed memory. Be cautious and on your guard, lest any of the heretics, meaning Karaites, that may they speedily perish, lest they mingle among you, for they are worse than apostates. Karaites are worse than Jews who become Christians and Muslims. If any of the heretic mingle among you and undertakes to corrupt the people, he will undermine the faith of the young, and they will not find a Savior. Beware of them. In other words, he was leading a polemical attack, but also a communal attack to keep the Karaites out. The Karaites were defined as being outside, and this is something that Jewish communities had to be very much engaged in. And he wrote something similar in the Mishnah Torah. This is text number 6. A person who does not acknowledge the validity of the oral law is not the rebellious elder mentioned in the Torah. He's not just simply someone who's rebellious. Instead, he is one of the heretics and should be put to death by any person. Harsh. Since it has become known that such a person denies the oral law, he may be pushed into a pit and may not be helped out. He is like all the rest of the heretics who say that the Torah is not divine, and those who inform on their fellow Jews and apostates. In other words, he's saying Karaites, they're just the same as Christians, when the implication, of course, is to marry a Karaite is the same as marrying outside the faith. And he elaborates on that. He goes on to say a little bit lower, the children of these errant people and their grandchildren whose parents led them away, and they were born among those Karaites and raised according to their conception, they are considered as children captured and raised by them. So you have to see the children of Karaites also as heretics. Such a child may not be eager to follow the path of mitzvot, for it is as if he was compelled not to. In other words, then he goes to say, even if later he hears that he is Jewish and saw Jews on their faith, he is still considered as one who was compelled against observance. Now, the implication here, this last part, is that he was very strict and almost draconian in how Jews are supposed to see Karaites and treat Karaites. But even by the end of this passage, he introduced the possibility, but the children of Karaites, as long as we get them when they're children, maybe, if it's done correctly, maybe they can be rehabilitated. Maybe. Now, he wrote the Mishnah Torah earlier in his life. If you go a little bit forward, about 20 years later, his attitude towards Karaites softened a little in practice, in practical terms. Legally, in terms of halakha, that's what he believed to be the case. But look at text number 7. This is a responsum he wrote probably 20 years later, after 20 years of being a leader of the Jewish community, dealing with his stuff in more practical terms. This is what he says about Karaites later. Quote, text number 7. I say that these Karaites who live in No Ammon in Egypt and Syria, these places in the area, and other parts of the land of Ishmael, should be treated with respect and dealt with honestly. In other words, now he's speaking in practical terms. Relations with them should be conducted in humility and the path of truth and peace. For as long as they treat us in good faith and avoid speaking obdurately and perversely and ignorantly of the rabbis in this generation, and all the more so, guard their tongues from speaking contemptuously of our holy rabbis of blessed memory, the Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud, according to his teachings and practices that we have learned from them and from the mouth of Moses, from the Almighty we lived, and we may therefore honor them and inquire of them, even in their homes. We can visit them. We can be friends with Karaites, okay? And circumcise their sons even on Shabbat, if they need help with circumcision, and bury their dead and comfort them. For as long as those who live here do not instantly express their heresy, we do not regard them as being in the same category. And then he adds here, because it may be that they will have excellent children, children who could become good Jews, who could be rehabilitated. Now you may be wondering, isn't this kind of contradictory? He was so harsh in his legal writing, but in this responsa, he's saying it very differently. I would say that his attitude toward the Karaites, is a textbook example of avoiding extreme positions. Because even he himself, he started out with a position about Karaites that was extreme. No, they are outsiders. You push them into a pit, exclude them entirely. But even in his own rethinking about, in practice, if we have neighbors who are Karaites, are we really, if we have nice people living down the block or next door who are Karaites, are we really supposed to shun them and put them in a pit? And he says, no. As long as you're aware that what they believe is not what we believe, that from our vantage point, what they believe is wrong, as long as you're aware of that, as long as you're not drawn to that, then yes, if they're decent people, you can be nice to them, especially if they're not Karaites who are actively criticizing Judaism or causing problems for the Jewish community. There's no reason to be antagonistic to them. Certainly, if it makes it possible, maybe their children will want to, from the vantage point of the rabbis, return to being Jewish in this conventional way. And so his whole modus of dealing with the problems of the Karaites is very much a symptom of what he was doing. But it's also, it's just one more thing that the Rambam had to deal with or in his day-to-day life. Now, I should say it a little differently because the Rambam, he knew he worked hard. In his letter to Ibn Tibon, he said, I am very, very busy. At no point in his life did he ever lament that. Oh, my life is so terrible. He loved his life. He cherished the responsibility. He felt privileged to be able to do so much to help so many people, so many different people, especially those in his own community. I'll give you one other example of his sense of balance. In his own scholarly work, He was an Aristotelian rationalist. He did not like mysticism. In fact, the one area of Jewish learning, or one thing Jews did was mystical speculation. He thought it was utter nonsense, and he just says, let's not waste our time doing that. And as so often is the case, his son, Avraham Maimon, was one of the leading Kabbalah scholars of his generation. And at no point did Maimonides ever say anything other than how proud he was of his son, the crazy child who can't believe he's actually studying Kabbalah. Why is he? I'm so proud of him. He's Shep Nachas. That's a little bit of a misnomer because Maimonides wasn't in the Yiddish world. Whatever the Sephardic equivalent of Shepping Nachas is, he was Shepping Nachas for his mystical son. But that's another example is, I don't like Kabbalah, but I'm not going to be so crazy not liking Kabbalah that I'm going to put down my own son. I'll leave you with this, because I toward the outset I said different groups kind of claim him. In terms of understanding how Maimonides would understand the world right now, there was one late 19th century rabbi. He was born in Hungary and he came to America, named Alexander Kohut. Full disclosure, he was one of the founders of the Jewish Theological Seminary, one of the founders of conservative Judaism. This is what he said about Maimonides. Now remember, he was someone who was very much engaged, not only in debates with the Reform community in New York, but also with the Orthodox community, especially the ultra-Orthodox community in Hungary, both of which he regarded as being overly extreme. So this is what he says. This is text number 8. Were Moses ben Amram, that's Moses in the Torah, or Moses ben Maimon, that's Maimonides, to rise from their graves and contemplate our modern Judaism, they would neither recognize the narrowness of Orthodox nor the Mosaism of the Reformers as being of the essence of the religion which they had taught. Now, when I tell this to people, typically they can understand why Maimonides wouldn't recognize Reform Judaism because it's a modern invention. But the notion that he wouldn't recognize Orthodox Judaism, how can that be? Kohut goes on to say, they would say, you who seek only the Spirit, that's Reform Jews, lose therefore the kernel of religion, while you who take only the husk, the shell, can for that reason never penetrate to the kernel. How then shall we find the pure and true Judaism? Only by the happy reconciliation of both paths, the middle ground, the mean. In other words, Maimonides today, Reform Jews, I'm not sure he would recognize them as Jews. He might. But Orthodox Jews, well, from what I've told you so far, if he saw Orthodox Jews, and especially, the hardcore Haredi ultra-Orthodox, he would think they were Karaites. That's how Maimonides would see them. But it's one of the things, the fact that, and what Kohut is really onto here, is not a specific prognosis of what he would think, is the fact that Maimonides, who lived 800 years ago, or 850 years ago, his ideas, his outlook, his way of being Jewish, his way of being a Jewish communal leader, his way of living in both worlds, the Jewish and the non-Jewish world, and his way of working tirelessly, day after day for the benefit of the Jewish world, for the benefit of the world. These are ideals that were central to him. They're ideals that are still central to us in the 21st century. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about any of this? Yes, Alan.
Two separate questions.
Yes.
One is, 2,000 years before he lived, the Torah talks about how to treat Zaharat, leprosy.
Okay.
And I'm assuming that the treatment had changed by the time of Maimonides, but how does he reconcile what's written in the Torah with modern treatment to not violate the Torah? The second question is, you described the Sephardic world as one which revered both Torah study and philosophy, and yet one of the interpretations today of Sephardim in Israel is that they're uneducated, they don't pursue philosophy.
Two very, very good questions. So the first question was about, I'll repeat in case you didn't hear. First question is, Maimonides as physician, how did he deal with the medical teachings of the Bible? in terms of them being authoritative. The model or the archetype or the metaphor that Maimonides used, as many other Jewish physicians would use, and I imagine physicians in general do this, he saw himself as standing on the shoulders of giants. So the Torah, the wisdom of the Torah imparted certain things about medical knowledge. He learned that, but because he's standing on the shoulders of the teachings of the Torah, and then the teachings of physicians who came before him. So not only the teachings of the Torah, but also the teachings of Galen and ancient physicians, he can see a little bit farther. He always believed that even if his conclusions were differing, they're building on and improving what came before. Now the other question about, yes, Sephardic Jews, many in Israel are uneducated. That's a different question that has more to do with their social status and the fact that when they came to Israel beginning really in the 50s, they were in many ways excluded from mainstream Israeli society. So for a long time, many of them were less educated. That had more to do with Jews coming from the Middle East and North Africa, which incidentally, they weren't only Sephardic, they were all, other things as well. Yemenites are not Sephardic Jews. We call them Edot HaMizrach, the Jewish communities of the Middle East and North Africa. It took them a generation at least to basically learn the system in Israel, to gain full access to education, both Jewish and secular. Also in Israel, there was something called protectia. They did not, and because they were not part of that community of Jews who had founded and built the state and built the government and built the Histadrut, it took them a generation to get full access. In other words, so they were socially they were treated as inferiors. They were outside, and that's one of the reasons they're less educated. But in terms of their view of the world, Sephardic Jews and other Edot HaMizrach were always more open. They always had a more seamless blend between the Jewish and the non-Jewish. They didn't have that sharp division that Ashkenazic Jews kind of mastered for so many years. Yeah.
Just to follow up with Alan's question, I was going to ask you at what point in history did this idea of just learning and not earning a living? It seems to me that even in Europe, that they would, get one or two Torah scholars that the community would support for a period of time, not this kind of thing that we have now, where it's just this general idea that everybody just learns and doesn't earn a living. And also among the Ashkenazi Jews, many of them don't have any kind of secular education, even in schooling now. They don't learn.
Right.
Among the really religious, they're only speaking Yiddish. They're not even learning English. But less so. Even there are schools around here that maybe give English for an hour or two in the week. That the kids don't learn basic science and things like that. I just was wondering.
So you asked two questions. One is about learning and livelihood, and the other is about education.
In historical context.
Yeah, in historical context. So not everyone did as Maimonides did. There were always cases of Jews, not only in the Ashkenazic world, but everywhere. Even in Maimonides' own community, there were Jewish scholars who just wanted to live off the dole and not work, and that's why he had to keep reiterating his criticism of them. But he believed that was a less ideal lifestyle. So, the whole idea of him of a kollel, where the community supports scholars, even though the kollel is sort of a nice idea, for Maimonides that said, no. You work and you learn. That's how you spend your life. In terms of education, that not learning secular things, that was something more Ashkenazic. In other words, in almost any period of time, if you walked into the home of a Jew who was not Ashkenazic, well, let me say it this way. If you walked into the home of a Jew who was Ashkenazic and looked on the books of the shelf or the books the children read or taught, Jewish books only, Hebrew and whatever the vernacular, Yiddish, Ladino, whatever. If you walk into the home of a Jew who was not Ashkenazic, not only Sephardic, but also, one of the Edot HaMizrach or Italian Jews who are not Ashkenazic, and you looked at the books on the shelf, you'd see the Jewish books, but you would also see non-Jewish books. You would see philosophy, you would see literature like Arabic, or in Italy, you would see Dante on the shelf for sure. It was really Ashkenazic Jews who did it. Now, what you're describing today is one of the characteristics of Orthodox Judaism, and this is really a separate kind of thing, especially ultra-Orthodox Judaism, or certain communities of Haredi Jews. They're trying to almost nostalgically return to what they've imagined as this Ashkenazic golden age situation of we live entirely according to the Torah and we're not bothered by anything. They have this nostalgic view of Eastern Europe that Jews just live with Jews, that Tevye, he rarely saw anyone who was not, there's no historical reality. You know, that world was invented in a literary way by Shalom Aleichem. Same way that Buffalo Bill Cody invented the West. It didn't exist. That image of the shtetl where, you know, everyone is Jewish and everyone observes Shabbat, no. That never really existed. But today there's a nostalgia for it, and so they're self-consciously trying to, well, in their minds, recreate it or revive it in the aftermath of the Shoah. But in reality, it never really existed in the way they imagined. But they're determined to bring it back, both in Israel and both in America and other places as well. Yeah, David.
In your time machine, if you could go back and have a conversation with Maimonides, do you think you want to hear more about bringing him up to date on science or on the fate of the Jewish people?
Ooh, what a great question. Well, I'm not going to presume to be able to bring him up today about science at all. I mean, do I have my dad with me or not? I mean, yeah, he'll take care of the science part. I would mention things. I mean, I would imagine if he met someone from the future, he would have questions for me, like how did this turn out? Probably what would surprise him, what would please him the most was, first of all, that how much of Judaism has survived in the way that he did it. Maimonides could come to shul here on Shabbat and be able to follow along in the service. He could lead the service, probably, except for the tunes, probably in a way which was familiar. He could read the Torah. You know, if he had his calendar, oh wow, you still have the same calendar for reading the Torah that he would love. He would love the fact that the founding of the Jewish state actually managed to take place. Then, of course, he would also be dismayed, though not surprised, by the moments of persecution, because he imagined that. He knew he was realist enough to understand that. What I would ask him, I think, you know, I think he would also say, this is something that Mark Twain used to always say, I am my books, I am my writings. He would say, if you studied me, you know me. And I got to say, he revealed a lot about himself in his writing. So I would imagine I would be more interested in answering any questions he had for me than for him. That science, you know, I could tell him, well, you know, I got a B in chemistry in high school. You wanna talk about that? I don't know I could tell you there. He probably knew more science than I do. He could probably, you know, flip through Newton, like physics, and know it better than me. But
I'm curious about learning in the 1100s.
yeah.
There were writings, but did the Jewish community have like one Talmud, the writings of the Talmud in the whole community? Did people have access?
The great.
How did they become a physician?
Both great questions. That's actually two questions. So I'll ask the second question first. He trained at the feet of several physicians, and that's how you became a physician in those days. You demonstrated an acumen, you demonstrated an aptitude, someone trained you, and then you became a physician, and then in practice, you would demonstrate how good you were. In terms of learning, the biggest difference between learning then is this is before there was print culture. Books were manuscript books, so they didn't have a lot of copies, but by the time Maimonides was around, there was a text of the Talmud. Now, it's not the same text we have, because the standard Talmud text we have today, you would have the text of the Talmud in the middle, and you would have Rashi on one side and the Tosfot on the other, both of which were Ashkenazic commentators. So Rashi's manuscript Talmud probably had the text of the Talmud, probably not Rashi. He might. Some people think he knew a little bit of the Tosfot, maybe a little bit of Rashi, but there are other Sephardic commentators. The Sephardic commentators he would have studied were those from Spain, like Shmuel HaNagid, or Chasdai ibn Shabrut, or the Rif, Yitzchak Alfasi. So it wouldn't be a situation where everyone had a copy of the Talmud. It would be the teacher and maybe a couple of other copies, but they would sit around. The method of studying the Talmud and the text of the Talmud was the same as it is now. you'd sit in a Beit Midrash and you would discuss these texts and you would ask questions. And if a new commentary came, you would study that too. You try to get your hands on as much as you can. Now, but you're right in suggesting it was much more of a run and gun affair than it is now, because they had fewer books and they didn't have print books, so a lot of it was learning orally. In other words, one person would read and everyone else would hear. And for someone with the aptitude of Maimonides, one of the things you really needed was a good memory. Be able to hear and remember, or read once and be able to remember and review without having to see it again and again. But he was able to do that. Yeah?
What do you think Maimonides' reaction would be to the information age of the internet?
Oh, well, it's partly a technological question. I think Maimonides, he didn't even know what the printing press was. So the first thing he would be blown away by seeing a printed book. He didn't know what electricity was. Never mind the internet, the basic communication that preceded the internet. He had never seen the telegraph. He had never seen a telephone, a radio, a television. In his world, any communication beyond, a mile or two of your town would take days and days. If someone sent him a question from a distance, it would take months to get there and months to get back. The instantaneous nature of the internet, it would blow him away. Now, the one thing that would make it a little more familiar to him is that the Talmud itself, which he knew thoroughly, the Talmud is a compilation of scholars who lived across several generations. So he did see, I guess in some rudimentary vision of people across time communicating, and I guess maybe he could imagine the fact that he could imagine a conversation between Akiva, who lived in Israel, and a scholar in Babylonia. If he actually saw the internet and could do it himself, after he was completely blown away by it, he would love it. And of course, he would be saying, he would be against doom scrolling. All the problems we have with social media, Maimonides would say, it's all part of, I think he would consider that an example of being too extreme in your use of social media. For example, the way people just read and believe without thinking critically, Maimonides would have railed against that. You have to be a thinking person. That's a great question. Great question. Yeah?
What do we know about his family?
About his family? Not a whole lot, okay? We know about his one brother that I mentioned. He had at least one other sibling, at least one other brother. He had several children. Only his son Abraham really became a reputable scholar. One of the things we also know is that for generations there were people tracing their family trees back to Maimonides. Now, I don't know. I don't think that many people. We need Henry Louis Gates on this question, because I'm not sure if that many people can be descendants of Maimonides. Everyone wants to be a descendant of Maimonides. So we know some. We know more about where he lived than the specifics of his own family. I think the way he writes about himself is he was a private person. He would mention his family when it was necessary. And there were times in his writings where, even to the end of his life, he was still lamenting the death of his brother. He really never got over it. He was crushed by it. But that's really the most he talks about his own person. He didn't regard himself as to be that interesting. He thought his teachings were interesting. And he was much more interested in helping students than talking about himself. Yeah.
What do you think about women, like what was written in the Torah?
You really? Okay. Yeah. Look, when it came to women, he was very much a 12th century person. So the whole notion of, any notion of egalitarianism between men and women, he would not have looked favorably on it in the context of his own time. Now, the reason was twofold. First of all, he was a rational thinker. So he started with the premise first: there was a necessary division of labor between mothers and fathers, men and women. Women are in charge of the home; men go out and study and work. And he thought that was valuable. He also believed that women did not have the intellectual faculty to handle the complex ideas of the Talmud and philosophy. Now, having said that, if we could bring him to today, or even 100 years ago or more, if he encountered women who were educated, who knew Talmud and philosophy, and hadn't lost their minds and become evil ogres or Karaites, I think he would change his mind. And if he could see the possibility of women, let's say, being called to the Torah and that not destroying the Jewish people, I think he would come around. Not right away, mind you. It would take him a good 20 years. So if he saw it, when he was younger, and then he would wait a generation to see, is this going to destroy the Jewish people? If he could be convinced that such changes were not lethal to Judaism and the Jewish community, he would embrace it, and he would find a way to explain it in terms of existing Jewish tradition, as others have done. But he would have to be, like other philosophers, he'd have to be convinced first. Yeah, Sherry.
Was he ever a physician to the King of Spain? Somehow my studies, I remember that.
He left Spain when he was 13. For most of his life, Spain was in transition, and Spain was really a battleground between Christians and Muslims, and between different Muslim tribes in southern Spain. So he didn't have that much contact. For him, Spain was a memory. He had a very idealized understanding of what Spain was before they left Spain. He understood that the Spain of his grandparents in Spain really was remarkable, but he also, in his own lifetime, Spain was a very chaotic place. For much of his lifetime, Spain was like Ukraine, or the boundary between Ukraine, everyone just fighting all the time, and the borders kept moving, and it was. Now, a century after he lived, if he had lived long enough, when it stabilized Christian Spain, he might have had some, a different disposition there, but he didn't have that much contact. There wasn't much for him to really do. There weren't that many, the Jews who were in Spain were in Christian Spain, so they were part of the Christian world, and the communication between the world of Christendom and Islam was not very easy. He didn't have much contact. But he did meet Jews from Spain if they came to Egypt. He met other emigres who were coming, but the King of Spain, not that I know of. Well, that's it. I thank you very much. Next week in our last session, we're going to go to the future. We're going to talk about Tel Aviv on its 150th anniversary. That'll be next Wednesday.